Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ernie Rose, Professor of Special Education and Educational Leadership and Director of the School of Education, Doctorate in Educational Leadership for Social Justice. And it is my distinct honor to give you a welcome today to the second annual Leavey Presidential Lecture, hosted primarily by Dr. Antonia Dardere, but also co-hosted by the LMU Family of Schools and the doctoral program here in the School of Education. The doctoral program is celebrating its 10th year, and it's been an exciting year for us. We're in the process of selecting our next cohort to begin next summer, and you know what we do with those cohorts? We start them out with Dr. Dardere. So they get the best of what we have right off the bat. Let me just say that it is a real pleasure to have Dr. Antonia Dardere as a colleague. She holds the only endowed chair in the School of Education, the Leavey Presidential Chair in Moral and Ethical Leadership, which is the title of the course that she teaches. And students are so drawn to her that many of them ask her to be their chair for their dissertation. I remember back a few years when I had the pleasure in another capacity of working with our Dean, Shane Martin, in first lobbying for and then establishing the Leavey Presidential Chair in our school. And then he did the good work of wooing Dr. Dardere away from the University of Illinois back to California, back to part of her roots. So it's a great pleasure that all of that has come together this evening. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our other co-host of the event, Mr. Darren Early, who is the director of our LMU Family of Schools. Darren?
Thank you, Dr. Rose. As he mentioned, my name is Darren Early, and I am privileged with serving as the director of the LMU Family of Schools. And in case you did not know, we are a partnership with 14 different schools in the K-12 schools in the Westchester Playa area. We have traditional public schools, public charter schools, and also Catholic schools, focusing on college and career readiness for our students, academic achievement, and then school culture and climate. However, I get a chance now to kind of talk about this community dialogue series, and it's weird because the dialogue series is being enhanced by our participation and our joining to the Leavey Lecture Series, and so this is amazing. But our community dialogue series was born out of several conversations between the LMU Family of Schools and the Doctoral Center, and we were looking for ways to partner, and we were like, how do we partner our work? How do we kind of put our work together so that it makes sense and it's cohesive throughout the School of Education for those two departments? But last year, we had our first community dialogue, and Dr. Dardere was a panelist. And it was about community partners and various different things happening with education in the community. And she was just Dr. Dardere. She was amazing. And not only that, when we finished, the conversation that she had about just supporting this ongoing of the dialogue, was really exciting too. And so this year, when we started talking about ways to continue the series, we realized that we wanted to focus on African American children. She not only provided us wisdom and support, but she also allowed us to have the Leavey Lecture Series as a centerpiece of our dialogue series. So just to give you kind of anecdotally the magnitude of the work that is done by Dr. Dardere, I'm currently in a doctoral program, and last night I was sitting with my dissertation chair, and I was talking about what we're going to do tonight with having Dr. Day come and speak with us in the Leavey Lecture Series. And many of you who are from LA are familiar with Dr. Sylvia Rousseau, and she's my dissertation chair. And as I'm talking to Dr. Rousseau, I mentioned Antonia Dardere, and she's like, Antonia Dardere, Dr. Dardere? I'm like, yeah. She's like, oh, I used all of her writings to do my dissertation. So it was just amazing. But it's a pleasure right now for me to do two things. One, I don't know where she is. There she is. The heart and the soul behind much of this all of this community dialogue series is Deanna Pittman. And so I just want to recognize Deanna real quickly. If we can give her a round of applause. Thank you, Deanna. And now it's my pleasure to turn this microphone over to Dr. Shane Martin, who is our Dean of the LMU School of Education.
Just briefly, I'd like to add my own words of welcome to all of you this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging just a few people who are with us. First of all, the chair of the School of Education Board of Visitors, Dr. Maureen Kindle, who's here with us. Dr. Kindle. And Dr. Kindle, who is a graduate of our own doctoral program, is the director of our Educational Success Project, which is putting together a major global summit on individuals with disabilities that will be held here, actually in this room, on Saturday, March 14th. So more information will be coming about that, but it's a very, very important international summit, and we bring it to your attention. And I also want to thank the two co-sponsors of this event, our doctoral program in Educational Leadership for Social Justice and our family of schools. And as Darren Early said, this is an important part of an ongoing series that we are having about community dialogues about building educational justice within our African American communities. So before I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Antonia Darder, I would like to say a few words about the Leavey Presidential Chair Lecture. As Dr. Rose mentioned, this lecture series was established last year in 2014, and it provides a community forum where prominent scholars in our field can critically engage a variety of ethical and moral questions in ways that can move us toward greater emancipatory life within schools and within the larger society. And through Antonia's leadership, we held the first Leavey Presidential Chair last year, and we're very thrilled this year to have such a distinguished speaker in Dr. Carol Brunson Day, who will be discussing the important topic of ethical concerns in the education of African American children, particularly as we sit 50 years after the publication of the Moynihan Report. And so now I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Antonia Darder, who in 1911 joined us, an internationally renowned Ferrian scholar. She came to us as the inaugural Leavey Presidential Chair, an endowed chair in ethics and moral leadership. Yeah, that's what happens when, and boy does she look good for 1911. You know, the issues are ageless and timeless, and all the more way that Antonia is just amazing. Thanks for pointing that out, Jill. But I will say that this distinguished presidential chair was established to ensure that deep and meaningful conversations about social justice, in theory and practice, could be fundamentally linked to ethical and moral questions. Dr. Darder's scholarship focuses on the critical issues of racism, political economy, education, social justice, and society. She's the author of the seminal work, Culture and Power in the Classroom, and also Reinventing Paulo Freire, A Pedagogy of Love. Most recently, she published Freire and Education. And, you know, I will add to Darren Early's story in talking about Sylvia Rousseau, who's also a great friend of LMU. I had that similar experience completing my dissertation work in the early 1990s. One of my major theoretical works was Culture and Power in the Classroom. And I think as that work now has, in the last few years, been published in a 25th anniversary volume, the framework, the thinking, the conceptual ideas, and the work itself is just so current today and such a powerful work. If you don't know that work, I really, really bring it up to you to take a look at. Antonia's also had the honor and privilege of studying and working directly with the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. So it's not simply conceptual. She also has a very lived experience with Paulo. We're so grateful to have Antonia, a tireless leader and advocate for so many in such an important leadership role within our LMU community. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Antonia Darder.
Okay, I want to try to get through this quickly so that so we can get right to the heart of why we're here. A former graduate of Erickson Institute in Chicago and Claremont Graduate University, Dr. Carol Brunson Day is a recognized leader in the field of early childhood education. For more than 40 years, Dr. Day has tirelessly championed for an early childhood education system that could effectively serve the social and pedagogical needs essential to the intellectual formation and social formation of all children in this country, not only white children and affluent children. For 20 years, Dr. Day was the CEO and the president of the Council for Professional Recognition, a Washington, D.C. based association that serves as a home for the Child Development Associate National Credentialing Program, as well as the National Head Start Fellowship Program. Following her tenure there, she went on to serve as the president of the National Black Child Development Institute in Washington, D.C., whose mission has been to improve and advance the quality of life for Black children and families through advocacy and through education. She is currently the board president of the National Association of the Education of Young Children, a leading organization in her field. Dr. Day has also served as a liaison for the international exchange between schools in Reggio Emilia, Italy, and early childhood community here in the United States. She sits on numerous boards. Actually, what I want to point out here is that her leadership has been a national leadership at a time when we most have needed it and continue to need it. She has authored publications. She's worked in terms of bringing the kind of professional development that really prepares early childhood educators and other teachers to work with children from disenfranchised communities, children who have dealt with issues of oppression, with racism. Her work in anti-racism is actually quite legendary. She is, I remember, in 1978, when I was a student at Pacific Oaks College, this was a woman whose vibrancy and her strength and her beauty of spirit was there for me as a student at a time when I didn't even realize that I might have something to offer the world. And when an educator opens in you that sense of what you have to bring and what you have to give, it's an awakening moment, a moment that awakens us to believe in ourselves. It was in Carol's class on culture and cognition that I first began to truly understand the significance of culture and its impact on our lives, the lives of our children and the communities. Her lucidity and formidable capacity to speak to a deep meaning of culture and to connect this with the impact of racism upon the lives of people of color was truly like a cool breeze on a hot summer's night, or that cool drink of water after traversing the arid desert of assimilative schooling that had been my life. With her brilliance and confidence, Dr. Day taught me to acknowledge the cultural wisdom that I embodied and to recognize the anxieties and angst I often experienced within white institutional arenas was a phenomenon that was simply reinforced by a hidden curriculum of assimilation that blamed children of color from impoverished communities for our own failures and blamed our parents for the poverty that we had to endure. She astutely guided us to understand not only the cognitive connections to culture, but also the historical struggles we embodied in our everyday efforts to survive the institutional structures of racism that shaped our lives. In March 1965, the Office of Policy Planning and Research of the U.S. Department of Labor issued a report entitled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, written under the direction of Patrick Moynihan. Despite the demand issued by the Moynihan report for, and I quote, equality in education and equality for results of outcomes, the report also concluded that the Negro social structure, in particular the Negro family, and its entanglement of pathology, was a problem that had to be corrected. Never did the report ever turn a critical eye upon the brutal history of the individual and institutional racism, which was at the heart of deep poverty that we experienced and was experienced by Black families and other poor families of color throughout this nation. In 2009, Dr. Brunson received the NAFCC Lifetime Achievement Award. That same year, she spoke at Capitol Hill at an education summit denouncing the achievement gap, a phenomenon which Howard Manning, a Superior Court judge in Wakefield County, North Carolina, termed academic genocide, pointing to the consistent historical patterns of educational inequality suffered by African Americans solely based on the conditions of poverty and the color of their skin. It was from Dr. Day that I first learned about Patrick Moynihan and the Moynihan Report, and I came to better understand the manner in which national public policies affected our daily lives and the lives of our children. So it seemed only fitting that on the 50th anniversary of the release of the Moynihan Report that we invite Dr. Day to present our second annual Leavey Presidential Lecture and to speak to us about the historical ramifications of the report upon African American children and their communities, both then and now, and to address the ethical concerns associated with questions of policy, education, and social justice. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Carol Brunson.
Okay. Well, good evening, and I bring you greetings from Washington, D.C., which is the capital city, of course, of these United States of America. But it's also a place where infant mortality is higher than it is in Jamaica, where the high school dropout rate has reached alarming proportions, where drug dealing has become the career of choice of many black and brown young men, and where quality education institutions and promising social programs to deal with these serious social ills are lacking. In other words, I bring you greetings from a city not unlike most large cities in the United States. And I apologize that my greetings are not uplifting like the wonderful California sunshine that I have been experiencing for the last few days. But neither are these stark realities of the social and moral decay that threaten the lives of today's children. I was talking with Antonia earlier and told her that it's really sometimes hard to face that is the situation our young people face today. Because I have spent my whole entire career working to change situations and improve the welfare of young children in general, and black children in particular, who are faring much less well than I would want or I would expect. So I'm here tonight with you because despite these truths, I firmly believe the life trajectories of our children can be changed. And I hold firm to the conviction and hope that you in the LMU community believe this as well. Thus, I am honored to be here with you tonight and want to acknowledge and thank you, Dean Shane Martin, Darren Early, Ernie Rose, and a special thank you to Antonia Dardere, who I knew as a young student, just discovering her own power, and whose distinguished career as a poet, an activist, and a scholar I have followed with great pride through the years. So tonight, for all of you, and especially for Antonia, I want to share with you my thoughts on the topic, ethical concerns in the education of African American children. And in so doing, share with you a bit of my journey in this work. Let me start briefly by explaining where I stand regarding the ethical concerns of the condition of black children today. And let's see if I know how to work this. Punch. Yes. Okay. Okay, we live in the great American democracy, right? Which promises access to all who participate, access to well-being and success in life through our educational institutions. Big promise. But when in the process of that education, children are convinced that there's no hope that their well-being and success will occur in their futures, I find that unethical. A promise made, a promise denied. When children are taught to despise and reject the historical origins of their own people, and taught that their families and communities make no contribution to protecting them or ensuring their growth and development, I consider that unethical. And when children are taught to participate in their own oppression and are given no tools to contribute to social change, I consider that unethical. There is so much about the overall condition of African American children in American schools today that poses, for me, an ethical dilemma. I ask myself as an educator, a lifelong educator, how did we get into this dilemma, and what must we do to get out? Because after all, I too once was an African American child. And now I am the parent of an African American child and the grandparent of 2 African American children. So I know this dilemma firsthand. But because I have had the good fortune in my life and my career to encounter mentors and teachers who helped me carve out a place in this field and a direction that was important and significant to me, I chose to spend my career working to understand and address these ethical dilemmas. My story begins in the 1970s, when I was a part of a study group of African Americans struggling to think about how we might improve the education of black children. And we had the audacity to write a book called Collective Monologues Toward a Black Perspective in Education. We were early childhood educators. My thoughts at the time were captured in an essay that was published in this book. The essay was called Rethinking the Study of Black Behavior. In that essay, I used the Moynihan Report on the black family as an example to demonstrate what was wrong with the way the behavior of black people is viewed and analyzed, and what impact that view was having on the schooling of black children. As Antonia pointed out, Moynihan's report in 1965 made the case. It was entitled The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. And in it, he listed a series of ills that he argued were the cause of poverty in black America. So my essay began with a quote that I felt captured the spirit of the Black Studies movement at the time. As long as the black researcher asks the same questions and theorizes the same theory as his white counterpart, the black researcher will continue to be part and parcel of a system that perpetuates the misunderstanding of black reality. Black Studies at the time identified the way an appropriate framework for the study of Black people. And they argued that Black Studies should be based on the nature of Black people, and not the nature of non-Black people. So as I struggled to embrace this perspective in my scholarship and teaching, this is what I wrote. Over the years of scholarly study of Black Americans, much inadequacy and bias has been evident. The Moynihan Report, for example, which to date is probably the most well-known study of the Black family, is an illustration of this. It described the family as crumbling based on the rates of dissolution of Black marriages, of families headed by females, of welfare dependency, and of Black illegitimate births. In summary, and these were his words, the Negro family is a tangle of pathology. Okay, so that's what we had to work with as we were educating students to work with Black children. So I decided to take on the Moynihan Report and identify the sources of error. And Antonio remembers this because I shared this with all of my students. I shared it with anybody who would listen. The sources of error that I identified in that report were four: a European worldview, ethnocentrism, victim blaming, and racism. Each of these factors served, I believed at the time, as a potential source of influence over the motivations of researchers, the nature of their objectivity, their expectations, and their conclusions. So what was supposed to be science was actually not science. It was influenced by these factors. And these same influences, I would argue, characterize social science today. So, let's quickly examine each of these. Worldviews essentially reflect value systems about the way the world should be, not necessarily the way the world is. It really is in the world of anthropologists that we have been given the concept of the worldview. And Kluckholm and Strodbeck, who wrote in 1961, proposed really the prevailing theory of value orientations, suggesting that every single human society has a worldview, because there are 5 basic problems that all societies have to address. They have to address and make a decision about the character of human nature, the relationship of man to nature, and they have to have a time orientation. They have to have a value placed on activity and make a decision about the relationship of people to each other. You might recognize this framework. I'm not going to go through all of these cells, but when we have heard discussions of the difference between Eastern and Western thought, Eastern thought is sometimes depicted as past-oriented, where Western thought is depicted as future-oriented. Or when comparing Native American views of the world versus European American views of the world, Native Americans are described as being in harmony with nature, whereas Europeans seek mastery over nature. So although Europeans are not the only group to have a worldview, their worldview has been a concern for Black studies social scientists, because they argued that the European value orientations were substantially different from African value orientations or African worldviews. Moreover, they believe that Black families are as much influenced by an African worldview as a European one, and that Black families cannot be accurately described or interpreted without taking that into account. So this chart shows the different cells identified as characteristic of African value orientations and European value orientations, and you see they are really quite different. I'm not going to go through them, but you will recognize, for example, just if you look at the time orientation, that's one that's quite commonly used to contrast African influenced time versus European influenced time. Europeans being future oriented, Africans being present oriented. I remember reading a study once where someone was attempting to demonstrate this, and they asked the question, they posed this question: if you were waiting for a friend, if you were supposed to meet a friend at a certain time on the corner, and you got there and the friend was not there, how long would you wait before you knew the person was not coming? This question was posed to European Americans, African Americans, and to continental Africans. European Americans, how long would you wait before you knew the person was not coming? Anybody want to venture a guess? Before you knew the person was not coming. 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Okay. African Americans? An hour, at least an hour. At least an hour, okay? That reflects, and of course the continental Africans were like 2 days. So that reflects a different orientation towards time. A different orientation, and it's not that any value orientation or worldview is better than the other. It simply is a way to characterize and understand and explain behaviors that are influenced by societal value systems. However, these worldviews, and specifically the European worldview, becomes a problem when inappropriately applied to render value judgments about a group. Which brings me to a discussion of ethnocentrism, the second factor influencing. Because it is ethnocentrism on the part of European American social science that has led to the description of groups in society in terms of the way they deviate from the Eurocentric norm. Ethnocentrism essentially is manifested in the establishment. You can read the definition. From an ethnocentric perspective, Africans are viewed as deficient whites and called uncivilized, which they are still called uncivilized. Ergo, Moynihan's view of the female-headed Black family considered matriarchy an unnatural state, because it's an unnatural state in the European family. And therefore the solution to the matriarchy problem was to reorganize the family into a two-parent unit in order to restore its natural state. But once you remove the ethnocentric lens and look at African American families, they look very different. One example is Robert Hill, who in his book, Strengths of Black Families, and this book dates back to the 70s really, suggests strong parallels in Black family life with the African value system. By viewing them as such, he accomplished a view of the strengths of Black families, which include a sense of protection among family members, a sense of achievement, orientation, and mastery, where children are pushed by their families to gain survival skills and contribute to the welfare and progress of the collective body. Black children are told their actions represent the race, emphasizing that achievement of the individual is dependent upon achievement of the race as a whole. Social scientists today, and there were other researchers in addition to Robert Hill, but social scientists today continue to fight this battle to describe African American families based on their own integrity and to avoid using African American standards as the norm by which everything is judged. But this sanctioning of white superiority is so consistently assumed and so deeply embedded that it has formed a rarely questioned implicit basis for inquiry. Which leads me to the third factor, which is racism. And there are so many perspectives on racism in the literature. Choose whatever. You'll see many different definitions which focus on practices and beliefs and social relations and so forth, all of which reproduce a racial hierarchy and social structure that yields superiority and privilege for some and discrimination and oppression for others. That said, I actually am not I'm not really here to debate the definition of racism, but I will tell you that I have used a definition in my work that I find useful for educators and human service professionals. And it focuses on two components of racism. The first is that it is an institutionalized system of relationships. It's institutionalized, giving one group power and privilege over the others. The second part of the definition that I use is that individuals can participate in racism, and racism occurs based upon its consequences as opposed to its intent. So we don't look for racist intentions. We look for racist outcomes and consequences. This construct or this particular form of analysis really comes from a construct that does indeed acknowledge other forms of racism. Personal versus institutional, and overt versus covert. But you can see that the covert institutional forms of racism manifest through practices like IQ testing, like tracking, the things that schools do, and good people participate unknowingly, but their consequences are to do damage to black children and other children of color, poor children as well. So these institutional practices in schools create ideological and structural constraints that inform school practices to the detriment of African American children. So racism, along with the first two factors identified, European worldview and ethnocentrism, becomes subtext, reinforcing the basic belief that black children are cognitively, socially, emotionally deficient because of their family life. So it becomes easy to accept the premise that the solution to African American children's lack of progress in school resides in fixing the family. So that's how you fix this situation. But actually getting to that solution requires another set of mental gymnastics, which is the final factor, and that is victim blaming. The practice of victim blaming was just brilliantly described by William Ryan as a way of thinking that causes us, and the us is really social scientists, but it influences the way we think as well as part of the general public, to look for the source of problems within the people who are affected by the problem. Okay, so it has 4 steps. 1, you identify a social problem, like Moynihan identified poverty or black social progress. 2, you study the people who are affected by the problem and figure out how they're different from the rest of the population. So he looked at the family and he determined that their value system was warped, and that the experiences that their children had within the family were deficient. The 3rd step in victim blaming, and this is the kicker, as my friend Barbara would say, you define the differences as the cause of the problem. So you say that black families are the obstacle to their own progress. The 4th step involves devising a plan of action to correct the differences. So what grew out of the reports like Moynihan's in the 60s were programs like Head Start, all aimed at changing black people and poor people in general. Now, we all love Head Start, right? But that's what Head Start is. We continue to see this even today in the literature around the achievement gap. And I spend a lot of time with that literature because I work with very young children, I'm retired, but I still am working with people who are working with very young children. And preschool education is often seen as the magic bullet for the achievement gap. So, what we have currently as a much talked about study is this Hart study done by Hart and Risley in 1995. Do any of you know this study? Well, this is the study that essentially counted words. Researchers went into families, low-income families, middle-income families, and professional families, low-income, working class, and professional families, and they counted the number of words that children heard, okay, over a 4-year period. And they identified a 3 million word gap. The difference in the number of words the children in professional families heard spoken was the difference between professional families and low-income families was 3 million words. So this study is often called the 3 million word gap study. And this view has repeatedly been used to confirm our belief that the achievement gap between high and low income children is linked to the differences in quality and quantity of verbal interaction in the children's homes. Okay, once again, turn right back to blame families. So instead of offering solutions that change conditions inside of schools and institutions that serve these children and families, we find ourselves redirected to the weaknesses and limitations inside poor and black families. So this circular logic, blaming the victim, when you add it to a mixture of the European worldview, ethnocentrism, and racism, it serves as icing on the cake, compounding and reinforcing the picture of the dysfunctional black family with dysfunctional black children, and directing efforts and resources whose intent ostensibly is to change the education and life trajectories of these families. Those resources are directed away from rather than toward that change. It is my observation that these processes have remained intractable over the years, over the past 50 years, and have produced largely cosmetic changes in how black children are viewed. So if you look at how they've been viewed over these past 50 years, first as culturally deprived, then as culturally disadvantaged, and now the more polite term, but no less derisive, at risk. Okay, we keep changing the cosmetic label, but the underlying view of black children's potential for success remains unchanged. They are seen as hopeless. And you all know from evidence-based scientific research on the self-fulfilling prophecy that low expectations yield low results. For where there is no hope for your future, there is no real plan made for you to achieve it. This is the pivotal point of my ethical concern. We, in good conscience, cannot continue to treat families and their children in this way. We who believe that the institutions in which we work can make a difference, we who are teachers and researchers and educational leaders, together we can and will change the outcomes for African American children in school. It is urgent that we redouble our efforts to reclaim successful futures for these children. It is urgent that we unite under the banner of equity, social justice, and empowerment. We must become an army of the urgent. So I ask myself and you, what would it take on our own terrain, inside of the schools where we work, and the teacher preparation institutions where we are employed, what would it take to stem the tide of ethnocentrism, of victim blaming, of racism, to accomplish this? What would it take? I'm going to suggest 3 areas of work for the Army, and I'm going to label them strategies and tactics, because we need to be an Army, where we can and must target our efforts. First, we must meet the challenge to develop culturally competent schools. Second, we must expand the anti-racism and with it the activism dialogue. And third, we must foster and proliferate successful images of successful black children. So let's go through these. First, cultural competence. This is a very popular notion in education reform circles. Everybody's talking about it, everybody's trying to do it. But my favorite definition is this one. Everybody has their own definition. This is my favorite. And it's my favorite because you see the phrase underlined, effectively change outcomes? That's the point of being a culturally competent school. You have to effectively change outcomes. If you're not competent. Surely there are some good examples of this right here in Southern California among the experiences that you have. Surely among your 14 schools, you've got some culturally competent programs. But I want to caution you that as you begin to look for and as you participate in developing, growing culturally competent schools, you must be willing to judge competence by its consequences rather than its intent. Let me share with you a wonderful example of cultural competence at the school district level that has received a great deal of national attention, and that's the Montgomery County Schools in Maryland. Do you know Montgomery County School System in Maryland. Okay. It is a school system with very high achieving students and very low achieving students. And when the superintendent, Jerry Wiest, came to town, he set his sights on attacking the persistent achievement gap, because there was an achievement gap. The white and Asian students were on top, the black and brown students were at the bottom. And Jerry Wiest succeeded, I think it took him 12 years, succeeded in narrowing the achievement gap in Montgomery County. On many measures, even at the same time the county was becoming significantly poorer and more diverse. In addition, the school system's top performers continued to make gains, winning the system national accolades. So the man made a difference in closing the achievement gap without doing harm, if you will, to high achieving students. He did a lot of things. He rearranged resources. He gave more resources to the schools within the district with low achieving students, but he did it very effective, and he did it very effectively. Because he was adept at working with the community, of navigating politics, forging alliances. He even worked with the unions to the point where he was able to develop a way to identify struggling teachers and then help them improve or dismiss them with the union's cooperation and help. Okay, because that's one of the obstacles often for developing culturally competent schools. Wiest took on race deliberately and directly, and he established a climate where race issues were discussed routinely and openly. He created mixed race leadership teams, and he set goals and metrics to determine progress. He demonstrated a way to narrow the achievement gap through data utilization, through accountability mechanisms, and through professional development. I encourage you to read about what he has done. This is not the only report. There are many, many reports. You can just Google Montgomery County Schools or Jerry Wiest. I think there are many opportunities to do this, as long as you know that you have to tackle institutional change and that you must be accountable for outcomes. Culturally responsive schools require culturally competent schools require culturally responsive teaching, which is another sort of a subcategory. But I treat it separately because we see a lot in the literature about culturally responsive teaching. And again, it has many definitions. I have one that I like because it identifies really a focus on identity of the students. It focuses on diversity and helping all children experience and value diversity. And it focuses on critical thinking, so that, in my view, culturally responsive teaching should happen for every child. This is not just a form of teaching that should happen for children of color or culturally diverse children. Teachers, in order for this to happen, though, teachers' knowledge about culture is important, because they have to understand what it is what is the central focus of this approach. And often teachers, if they misunderstand culture, they will inaccurately assess children's competence or plan incorrectly to promote children's learning. So my first tactic is that educators have to develop a really deep understanding of culture, really from an anthropological point of view. They have to be able to understand that those worldview concepts, and really what those value orientations represent. They have to learn how to discover ethnocentrism and cultural bias in their own work. And I see this as a responsibility of the Teacher Preparation Institution to get this process started, because this is not something that you can just read an article about and get it. it requires deep levels of discussion and processing. But also, it will increase teachers' capacity to use culture as a context for learning and development. And I think that is an important element of culturally responsive teaching. As they, using culture as a context helps bridge children from home to school and helps ensure their chances of being successful or being seen as successful, perceived as successful. Teachers have to be aware of their own cultural perspectives because that is where understanding culture starts, within the person. We're not talking about labels for modes of dress, for manners of participation in holidays and so forth. We're talking about a deep level of understanding value orientations and behavioral tendencies that are influenced by them. I want teachers to develop a serious sense of themselves as cultural beings as well as human beings. Another tactic, and I'm going to use this as my last example, is to learn about the relationship between culture and power. And that means thinking about the role of activism and what it takes to participate in critical thinking about culture and power. Given the diversity of children and families today, I think teachers must help children become bicultural. It is important that children who come into schools that essentially are governed by Eurocentric standards, that they learn how to operate successfully both in the school and at home in the larger world. And that means becoming essentially bicultural. Teachers have to also face the dilemmas that will be presented in the context of becoming bicultural. And what happens, for example, from an ethical standpoint, when schools have policies like English only, which California, I don't understand English only policies, but I know that they exist. For me, I think that for schools to hold language development in such high regard and work so hard to help children become proficient, and schools know that language is a key to accomplishing other kinds of skills in school, that how can they consider children accomplished if they can't even hold a conversation with their grandparents? I just don't understand that. Also, teachers have to be skilled and help parents engage in the strategies they are going to need to help their children navigate a system of values that don't value them, a system that does not value them. And believe me, families understand that, and it's what poses such dilemmas for them, ethical dilemmas. Should I encourage my child to speak Spanish? Should I just let it go? Those questions arise because families recognize that their ways of life are not valued, and they think that if they give them up, it will help them become successful. I could go on, but I won't. These challenges actually are articulated well by Lisa Delpit in her book, Other People's Children, and by Antonia Darder's book, which brilliantly illustrates these and others in very great detail. Culture and power in the classroom. I just want to read one quote, which for me captures the essence of this struggle, and it is a very complex struggle. If the bicultural voice is to be awakened and students of color are to become active social agents in the world, educators must create conditions for a genuine form of cultural democracy to take root in the classroom. One that not only creates space for all aspects of their humanity to be expressed, but also allows their cultural particularities to be in critical conversation with the universal human dimensions that are also vital to their identities and relationships with others. What that means is we must not be afraid to bring culture into the lives of schools. It is probably the most important thing we can do for ourselves, for children and families, and for this society. It's a tall order for the army of the urgent, but no more important, no task more important. However, moving along, the anti-racism dialogue has got to be expanded. And this dialogue has to be expanded both in schools and in the university, okay? Here's a whole list of things. I'm just going to rattle some of them off. We've reached a time in this country when there's just a huge commitment, verbal commitment within our society to racial diversity. And it's pervasive in the schools. But the evidence that it has produced significant consequences leaves much to be desired. My observation is that a lot has been done in classrooms to promote racial equity, but it is through curriculum changes. We have things like racially diverse heroes that are studied, and we just haven't done enough to remove the institutional infrastructures that produce and reproduce inequalities. So in schools, we want to shift away from the study of lifestyles and shift the focus onto institutional policies and practice. In the university, we're talking about preparing teachers and human service practitioners and who are convinced that they have a responsibility as human service professionals to work as agents of change. Agents of change, addressing the negative responses to race and culture that exist in institutional practice. There's so many important strategies, but one of them is just to really explore institutional racism or racism in its institutional form. This is the work that I and my colleague Louise Dermott Sparks did with human development students at Pacific Oaks College, where we just spent a whole semester focusing on racism, what it is, what it isn't, having students really, through a very slow and specific process, explore the impact that it had in their lives, both white students and students of color. Okay, I'm going to go back. Nope. Off. On. Okay. Continuing the dialogue, I think it's important. That when I talk about the university, this responsibility to work with students around their images and skills and strategies to become change agents themselves. This challenge also extends to the faculty. In your roles within the university community, you too must become advocates to eliminate institutional racism. In the higher ed academy. Surprise. So what can you do? Seek out marginalized voices on the topic of education of marginalized students. They often don't get into the mainstream. make certain that there are diverse voices as part of the faculty, so that issues can be viewed from a variety of perspectives. I'm sure you know the strategies that can be used. You want to work, I would say, to make the university a high-performing and inclusive organization, and establish measurable goals and monitor progress. That's a critical part of knowing what you have accomplished and keeping the focus on consequences. Finally, the last strategy. Proliferating positive images of successful Black children and families. This has been one of the major themes of my work as well. And it sounds very simple, but it is so critically important because it's hard to really absorb the massive numbers, the massive amount of negative imagery that comes into our space all the time. And I think it's important to take a bold stand to combat that, to add to our repertoire positive images of Black children and families. I think that for the Army of the Urgent, I charge you to seek out and live answers to this question. How can we plant and sustain the notion that African American children are indeed brilliant, that they come into this world as whole human beings, full of potential, strong, resilient, and capable of success in school? That's the message we need to continue to plant, because we are bombarded by the opposite message. So how do you do this? Number one, find places where Black children thrive. And if you don't know where any are, I can tell you. Look in the Black Independent School Network. There's at least one in most major cities. I think there are probably some here in Los Angeles. I know there is one in Washington, D.C. I know it well. Do you remember the Black student about 10 years ago, a girl, Skylar Bird, who scored a perfect 1600 on her SAT? She attended the Black Independent School in Los Angeles, in Washington, D.C., excuse me. She went to that school from preschool through elementary, okay? Find a public school where achievement scores are at the norm or higher. They exist. Schools that defy the general achievement gap trends. Ron Edmonds, many years ago, in response to another report that the federal government issued on public education, the Coleman Report, Ron Edmonds set out to find schools where children from low-income families were highly successful, and he found them. And he found characteristics that those schools have in common. Find them in this community. These images will help to mediate the negative images that are continuing to bombard us. Go out of your way to identify guest speakers for your classes and presenters for conferences who discuss the success of Black children. Someone told me about a dissertation that is being written looking at successful Black women in freshman college year. Study success instead of continuing to study failure. We want to find people who start from a premise that young Black children are creative and resourceful learners, who will suggest strategies to help create systemic change that assures that educational success and achievement are within reach. I have many suggestions. I encourage you to think we're really coming to a close here. But I want to share with you there are just so many things that can be done to reconstruct how we present the imagery of our children. Why would we do this? We want to change the image. We want to change the response to black children as hopeless. And I direct you to 8 organizations that are dedicated to so doing. The work of the National Black Child Development Institute is one of those groups. Their latest publication is entitled Being Black is Not a Risk Factor, a strength-based look at the black child. This is a brand new publication, and it tells the story of resilience in the face of despair. They include points of proof from organizations across the country that serve not as exceptions, but as examples of places where black children are successful. In conclusion, I implore you to become part of the Army, to examine and change this society's deep-seated negative beliefs about black children's abilities to grow, to learn, and to thrive. I implore you to be part of that army that speaks up and speaks out on behalf of black children's success. I implore you to be in that army that rallies to support places where black children thrive. I implore you to be in the army that turns their attention away from those who do not believe black children can be successful in school and in life, and toward those who demonstrate that they do by standing up for them. These are significant strategies and tactics, but they are only starters. There are so many more ideas amongst you and within your reach. And I am confident that our persistent and unrelenting actions as an army of the urgent can indeed guarantee each child successful experiences in school and in life. In closing, I want to quote passages from a Margaret Burroughs' magnificent poem, What Shall I Tell My Children Who Are Black? What shall I tell the children who are black of what it means to be captive in a dark skin, raised in a white world, where only white has been made to represent all that is good, pure, and decent? What can I do that they may come through life as whole human beings, unwarped in a world of biased laws and inhuman practices? That he might survive, and survive he must, for who knows? This black child bears the genius to discover the cure for all sickness, perhaps, or to chart the course for exploration of the universe. So succeed he must for the good of all humanity. I have drunk deeply of late from the fountain of black culture and discovered the truth of my heritage, the truth so often obscured. And I find I have much to say. Thank you.
Oh, wow. We've been making a tradition of this award, our Leavey Lecturer Award, to thank our distinguished speakers for their contribution to LMU, but more importantly, for their contributions to the world and their efforts to make the world a more just place. So today we give this award to Dr. Carol Brunson Day. Dr. Day exemplifies the kind of leader we continue to need in the world. Despite the difficulties that she has known, she's always kept her eye on the prize. There was a moment where I've seen Dr. Day deal with difficult circumstances where her brilliance and her efforts and her contributions were not, I believe, were not understood.
Absolutely not.
Nor were they appreciated. And yet what she did was she held her head high, and she knew that that wasn't a sign to stop or even to become discouraged, but instead that you just go on and you find another way to serve, and you provide leadership because there's so many places. And so watching her as a student to do this, that she continued, and not only did she continue, she raised her voice in a way that caused people to listen, that she may not even have had the opportunity if she had stayed in the other circumstance that did not appreciate her. So what she showed is the resilience, that we who struggle and we who say that we are about making another world, it is a kind of strength that we too must show. And so we give you this award, Dr. Day, Carol, my beloved Carol, for all that you have brought to the lives of children, of communities, and teachers, and the ways that you continue and that your work will continue long after we are all gone.
Wow, thank you. Well, all I can say is that I am so appreciative of this. At this point in my career, it is, you can't imagine how rewarding it is to know that you have had an influence and that your students are better than you are. And it just feels so good. Thank you.
And you know that that's not true. But anyway, all right. So are we? I'm so happy that you all came out tonight. I can't tell you. I mean, it's just every year getting better and better, and we'll continue this, and we'll make this an opportunity for us in the LMU community to engage issues together and to enjoy some time. There's a wonderful spread out there that we have for reception. We hope that you guys will mingle and come and meet Dr. Day. Say hello, and thank you so much for being part of our community. Thank you.